Well, hello everyone. It's John Lockland here. I'm the director of FED International, Forum for Democracy International. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm delighted to see that our co-host Jeremy Nell is online, and I'm even more delighted to welcome this week as our guest Thomas Fazi, who joins us from Rome. I'm not in Paris this week, but instead in the west of France, in the Vendée, where I teach. Thomas, it's incredibly kind of you to agree to be with us this week. I've been trying to get in touch with you and to get you on as our guest for a while, as you know, because I'm a huge admirer of your work. Your Substack, thomasfazi.com, covers a whole range of subjects, all of which I'm interested in. Everything from, I'm looking at it now, from the recent Brics summit in Kazan to the events in Georgia, to the Nord Stream pipeline, and so on and so forth. And also your writings, of course, in the British publication Unheard on the European Commission. You've done fabulous pieces on Ursula von der Leyen and on her power grab. There's an awful lot to talk about, but we've chosen for as a subject the idea that the marriage between Europe and America is a marriage from hell. And I chose that, of course, because we'd fixed on the date of today, 6th of November, the day after the elections, whose result we now know. What's your feeling, Thomas? I would have thought the marriage must now be on the rocks with the election of Donald Trump. What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, John, and for your very kind words. As you know, I'm a fan of your work as well, and your books. Wow. So yeah, what happens now? I guess that's the $1 million or €1 million question that everyone has, especially when it comes to Europe. And I think it's the whole debate about Trump's potential victory and now Trump's victory in here in Europe over the past months has been quite surreal, in my opinion, because the tone has mostly been that of dread at the prospect of a Trump victory, at least in terms of the dominant narrative coming from the EU establishment and most EU leaders. We've heard talk of the need to Trump-proof the EU and Trump-proof NATO, it's all quite surreal because what EU leaders seem to fear the most from Trump is actually what we should be hoping for, I would argue, as a strategically oriented Europe that wants to chart its own destiny and its own course in the world, something that it's been unable to do for a very long time now, if it ever really has. So if we look at what the greatest fears about what this Trump presidency could mean for Europe, we often hear that Trump wants to disengage from NATO, and especially would there's this a risk of Trump wanting to bring unilaterally bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end by coming to a peace deal with Russia on Putin's terms. That's another thing we often hear, and that this would be utterly disastrous for Europe, allegedly. And this narrative makes no sense whatsoever. Not only because I fear that neither of those two things are entirely true. So the premise, I would argue, is flawed to begin with, in the sense that Trump is clearly not going to pull the U.S. out of NATO, and I don't think he's uninterested in maintaining U.S. control over NATO. I think he wants Europeans to pay a bigger share of their participation in NATO, and he wants them to ramp up their defense spending. But he definitely doesn't want to give up on NATO. I would argue, and also when it comes to his alleged plans to strike a peace deal with Putin, I think again this is even assuming this is actually his intention. This is I think this is wishful thinking. I think he
Yeah,
once said that
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think he was going. He once said that he was going to bring the conflict to an end in 24 hours. And of course, we should never take Trump too seriously when about anything he says. But I mean, but even if we assume that he's serious about his intentions to bring the conflict to an end, I mean, he himself seems to be stuck in a very America-centric view of the world, where it's ultimately up to America, or it comes down to America to bring this conflict to an end. Or that he could somehow force Putin to sit down and come to a peace deal, when in fact I think now the ball is clearly in Putin's hands. He's winning on the battlefield, and it's up to him to decide whether he will agree to a peace deal, and if he does, he is going to set, I think, a very hard bargain and very hard conditions for that deal, which I think even a Trump-led administration might have a hard time agreeing.
That's right. I think that's right. And I think that people forget, don't they, that Trump, on some aspects of this conflict, has been extremely hawkish. When he was, during his first term, it was he who introduced, or at least his administration and the Congress that he cohabited with, which introduced the extraterritorial sanctions against Nord Stream. And only the other day he boasted about this and said, "I'm the one who put an end to Nord Stream," which he did, because the construction of the pipeline was stopped for nearly a year. And the reason, and that's not a coincidence. That's just not, it's not a one-off. He did that because there is, leaving aside all the other geopolitical aspects of the Ukraine war, there is, of course, an energy war, an underlying energy war, as you know, between America and Russia. America having become, in the last couple of decades, I believe in the last 20 years or so, as a result of fracking, having become a major competitor, particularly in the gas market, against Russia. So there's an underlying economic interest, if you like, on the American side for Russia to be kicked out of the European gas market, which Trump is totally signed up to, and which he definitely signed up to when he was president. And that fact, again, leaving aside all the sort of Russophobia, which dominates the American political establishment and indeed the British, that is not going to go away, and Trump is definitely not going to make it go away.
Absolutely, and when it comes to Ukraine, we should never forget that Trump is the one that started supplying lethal weaponry to Ukraine, which the Obama administration had not done. So until then, we had only provided non-lethal weaponry to Ukraine. So that clearly, so Trump played I would say, a key role in escalating the situation in Ukraine, for which, of course, he should be held accountable for. So, I think, so what we have is, on the one hand, European mainstream leaders sort of projecting their own fears about what Trump's going to do, which I think he won't. Which again, I think, says a lot about the capability of European leaders to truly read reality. I mean, they seem, increasingly just, unanchored and detached from reality, and just unable to read basic political dynamics. And so they sort of project these fears that are completely unfounded. But even more absurdly is that they conclude that these scenarios that they conjure are negative. And so this, which makes it even more absurd, on a sort of psychological level. So even assuming that Trump really is going to go for this completely pro-isolationist, America first policy, which I'm afraid he won't, not even with regards to Ukraine, as we've been saying. But assuming he did, that would clearly be a positive thing for Europe. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that America's grip on Europe is really proving to be and has proven to be for a long time a strategic disaster Europe's economic and geopolitical interests. I mean, I think this has been true for a very long time, but it has been increasingly apparent ever since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, where we've clearly seen the European and American interests diverge dramatically when it comes to the impact of this war. This war has had a devastating impact on Europe in economic terms, in energy terms, in geopolitical terms. It's set Europe on a trajectory of economic decline, of deindustrialization, of geopolitical irrelevance, as Europe has become sort of hyper vassalized to a degree that it's never been before. I would say never before since
I agree. It's got worse. It's got worse in recent.
Worse than it's ever been, to a degree that Europe has never been fully sovereign and never from America. But what we've witnessed in recent years is something I think that we've never seen before, which is sort of condemning Europe to complete geopolitical irrelevance, making Europe the laughingstock in the eyes of the world. And you mentioned Nord Stream, and I think that's really paradigmatic of the state we're in. It's an open secret, and in fact, it's now even part of the semi-official narrative that the U.S. government either played an indirect or direct role in the actual bombing of the pipeline itself, or at the very least knew. If we want to assume that the story about a bunch of Ukrainian rogue operatives blowing it up, sort of unbeknownst to the Ukrainian government, is true, even if we want to assume that sort of highly questionable story makes sense, even based on the official narrative, I mean the one published by the Wall Street Journal not too long ago, we know that the U.S. knew about this this plan in advance, and at the very least did nothing to stop it. So even going by the mainstream narrative, we have our supposed ally either directly committing or closing an eye on one of the worst terrorist attack on a European infrastructure in ever. And I think, and then we have all of Europe's political class remaining completely silent about this and just kind of sweeping the whole thing under the carpet. And I think this is really telling of the level of political and even psychological subordination that European leaders
I like
have when it comes
I like
to
that a lot. I like
the relationship.
Can I jump in?
I think, it goes beyond politics at this point.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy. Jeremy Nell from South Africa.
I know that we're chatting about the marriage between the United States and Europe, but I'm from South Africa and we represent Brics, and so I feel like we're that girl at the bar waiting to be bought a drink. What do you think? What do you think Trump's relationship with Brics is going to be going forward, knowing the growth of, in particular, China?
Well, I mean, I think that's another big question. We know that officially Trump continues to hold a very hawkish approach when it comes to China, and I think that's probably, along with, from my point of view, his equally unconditional support for Israel. I would say that that's the most problematic aspect of Trump's foreign policy. We know that he was the one that initiated the trade war with China during his first administration, and throughout his speeches, he's continued to sort of paint China as the main enemy. And in fact, much of his talk about wanting to disengage from the European theater, from the Russia-Ukraine war, is based on the idea that the US should focus on China and on the coming conflict with China, rather than wasting time with Russia and with Ukraine. And a lot of the sort of foreign policy people that he surrounded himself with, such as Elbridge Colby and others, are very much anti-China hawks. And so on the one hand, this would appear to be very problematic, because I think we can all agree that if America, goes down the path of escalating military tensions with China, the consequences could be absolutely catastrophic. I mean, China is not Russia, even though that I would say that there are clearly important elements of the U.S. establishment that are trying to use the same playbook they used in Ukraine in Taiwan. Clearly, the democratic establishment was very much pursuing this strategy, but there are a lot of China hawks close to Trump that also support this policy of sort of using Taiwan as a casus belli to draw China into a war. Now, I would say if we want to look for some hope, Trump is also a very pragmatic leader, and so I would imagine that he realizes that this policy is clearly completely suicidal. There's simply no way the U.S. can win a war in the South China Sea. China has been preparing for this as a result of the U.S.'s increasingly aggressive approach. We can also we might be able to witness some de-escalation when it comes to Taiwan in the name of pragmatism, or at least that's what I hope. But of course, I think we're going to see a doubling down of the U.S.'s confrontational approach to China in the economic sphere. So I think we're going to see a continuation of the U.S.'s protectionist approach when it comes to China, and but more in general, what will this mean in terms of America's relations with the BRICS? More in general, very hard to say because you've got within the BRICS, you've got so many micro dynamics going on. So of course you've got within the BRICS, you've got what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and we know that Trump has a certain position about that. You've also got, of course, aside from China, the BRICS also encompasses what is happening in the Middle East, to the extent that Iran is part of the BRICS, and we know that Trump also has a very confrontational approach when it comes to Iran. So honestly, I think there are so many factors at play that it's almost impossible to say what approach he's going to take to the BRICS as a whole. I would imagine that he's going to try to compartmentalize the various, his approach to the various conflicts, and so avoid taking, dealing with the BRICS as a bloc, and he's going to try, I think, a more kind of bilateral approach. That's always been kind of Trump's approach to politics. He's never been a big fan of multilateralism.
The ultimate deal. Yeah.
He'll avoid trying to engage with the BRICS as a bloc, also because that would put him in a position of weakness, and so he's going to try, I think, to deal with individual countries within the BRICS, depending on the sort of dynamics at play with regards to America's relationship to each country. So I think a lot of that. So what is more interesting for me is how will the BRICS react as a bloc to Trump's attempt to bilaterally engage with individual countries within the BRICS, but not with the BRICS as a whole. Because Trump, I think, will also try to drive divisions within the BRICS. At least, that's what I would do from Trump's, if I were Trump. And I think that's what he's going to try to do. And so I think this might prove to be this will prove to be an important testing ground, I think, for the BRICS. Is the BRICS going to be able to act as a bloc and to sort of harmonize the interest of its various members, rather than allowing them to engage with the US on a sort of one-on-one basis. I think also, I think, sort of moving forward, so sort of not focusing immediately on the short term, but I think what I find interesting, and this is also concerns Europe, I think. So I think when it's clear that a Trump presidency is going to boost conservative ideals, conservative movements, right populist movements in the West. And I think when we think of what conservative is, or what conservatism should be, I think then we realize that this also has a potential to have important geopolitical implications. So for now, when Europe, especially European right populist parties, are quite divided when it comes to geopolitics, and a lot of that, when it comes to especially Ukraine, and a lot of that, of course, has to do not with who is sitting in the White House, but the kind of the where they sit in the hierarchy of power with regards to the European Union, which is why Meloni, as a country that is in the euro and which has a very limited sovereignty, has a very pro-establishment position when it comes to Ukraine, while of course Orban, who is not in the euro and has a very different position. But I think if we look forward, it makes sense to conclude that to the extent that conservative movements adopt a sort of or reject liberal progressive values domestically, it would make sense for them to also reject kind of liberal progressive interventionist values when it comes to foreign policy. And this opens up some very interesting possibilities, because and also Trump, in his very confused way, does reject this kind of liberal interventionist worldview. I think just the other day I saw a video of him saying, what do we care if women wear, the hijab or the burqa? That's none of our business. That's their business. And
yeah, he did say about Iran, for instance, that the United States should not be pursuing regime change because we've got enough of our own problems, and if we start doing that, then where will it end?
Exactly. And so to the extent that the BRICS are promoting an idea of sort of a new idea of international order, international system, which is based on non-interventionism, sovereign equality, civilizational distinctiveness and civilizational diversity, and the respect for different civilizations, different cultures, the rejection of this liberal universalist idea of a single set of moral values which the West has to impose on the world, then you realize that potentially there's a lot of room for convergence between Western conservatives and in terms of foreign policy and in terms of the international order and what the BRICS are proposing. And I think this also explains why a lot of conservatives, for example, look favorably upon Russia's model, because we're seeing this growing trend of Western conservatives that find themselves more in agreement with sort of Russia's conservative culture than they do with the ultra liberal progressive culture that we have, that is dominant today in the West. And so we could imagine that a strengthening of conservative movements, and also sort of them being able to build a more coherent worldview among themselves, but especially when it comes to foreign policy, could lead to a situation where they fundamentally find themselves very much in agreement with the kind of world order that the BRICS are trying to build. Because what the BRICS are trying to build is a very conservative order in terms of the international sphere. It's very conservative. I mean, it's all about the need to respect national traditions, national languages, national norms, national values, and not to impose your values on others. That's a deeply conservative worldview. It's a deeply conservative foreign policy worldview. So my hope would be that the kind of longer term impact of a Trump presidency is that of a greater flourishing and a strengthening of forward thinking conservative parties of movements, and more forward thinking than the kind of thinking that we see among most, I would say, right populist parties today, with very few exceptions. But that this, that this is could kickstart a flourishing of a more modern, if you can pass me the term, conservative approach to politics, or one that is more sort of attuned to the times that we live in, which embraces this, which embraces conservatism, not just at home, but also in the international sphere. So I think this could be the kind of, this could potentially be the most interesting impact of Trump's presidency in the long term, I think.
I think that's right, and I think you said a moment ago, Thomas, that you said you made reference to European leaders' psychological submission to America, and I think that's an extremely important element. You see, we've talked in the first few minutes, haven't we, about Trump's own predilections, and we've talked about various objective things which exist in the world, such as, for instance, America as a producer of gas and so on. But I think that what you said about psychology is very, very important, in particular because of what you then went on to go and say about how his victory will obviously, inevitably encourage whatever we want to call them, conservative populist movements in other countries. Viktor Orban, whom you've mentioned, has been rooting openly for Trump for months, and now, of course, he will have wind in his sails, and others will get the same idea. And I think that while the challenges that that Trump faces, are gigantic, because what the last few months and even the last 8 years have shown us is that he has the whole of the American deep state against him, all the big agencies, the big departments of state, the Department of State, the Pentagon, the various intelligence agencies. So he has an absolutely gigantic task in American domestic political terms, and that deep state, or that state, is of course the primary motor behind the liberal democracy, which you've just accurately described as being the cause of friction with the Brics countries. So his task is absolutely gigantic, and he may well fail. I mean, who knows? I imagine he'll be less naive than in his first term, and he certainly failed in his first term. Perhaps second time round, and with the prospect of, if not his own re-election, then perhaps who knows, Vance taking over in 4 years' time. He may or may not succeed. But what I think he can do in the immediate term, without huge resistance, would be to remove one of the things which has characterized the Biden administration, and that is the absolute centrality of LGBT policy. On Biden's very first day in office in 2021, he signed a presidential executive order or decree which basically supported gender theory and transgenderism and so on. And ever since he's been in power, Biden has repeated this kind of thing. He's signed all kinds of orders. He's instructed the State Department to put LGBT values at the heart, not just of foreign policy, but of the entire activity of the American government. So now all kinds of government departments and agencies, including things for like the agency for, or the Department for International Trade and arms procurement, they're all required to show that they're LGBT.
Yeah.
What?
And the Secret Service as well, as we learned during
exactly everything. But I mean, even things which shouldn't, like, as I say, trade or whatever, which you would have thought didn't have any particular role in that area. And that perhaps is something that he can do, which, as I think you've rightly said, Thomas, could make a big change.
Yeah,
and above all, it's psychological. That's what I'm saying. It's psychological. The very fact that he's there, the very fact that he is there against not just the American deep state, but also the globalist deep state, I think the reverberations of that are indeed potentially immense.
Absolutely. No, I mean, your mentioning of the so-called deep state is fundamental. I mean, the reason why I can't say that I was hugely excited about these elections is that I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that the president is not really the one in charge in American politics, and neither is, to a full extent, Congress. There's clearly a state within the state that wields huge power, huge influence, and to a large degree will stop at nothing to get what it wants. And we've got ample examples of that throughout U.S. history, up to and including assassinating political leaders. So I think this is a reality that we have to contend with, without being afraid of being accused of being conspiracy theorists. I mean, I think we've all seen a clearly sort of cognitively deficient president supposedly rule a country for several years. And I think that in itself is very telling of the fact that he clearly was not the one in charge. There are clearly,
it's an essential point to recall. I'm about to give a talk on this, and that's exactly the point I'm going to make. We now know, we can speculate as much as we like about what Trump will do in the next 4 years, but we do know certain things now with absolute certainty, and that's one of them.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that now it's all up to Trump, and that he can, even within the constraints of U.S. parliamentary politics, he can get away with anything that he can get Congress to vote on, is a very naive view. That's just not how the U.S. system works. I would argue that, given the increasingly oligarchic trend throughout all Western countries, that's not how almost any Western country works anymore. And in fact, I would say that these problems are even more exacerbated in the EU, given the extent that democracy has been even formally hollowed out in the European Union as a result of the process of European integration. So I think this is a reality that we have to contend with. I think it's a reality that, contrary to 8 years ago, Trump understands better than anyone else, which is why I think honestly, I've been very underwhelmed by Trump's campaign compared to Trump 1.0's campaign, which I found to be a great sort of a great fusion of sort of left-wing economics and conservative cultural politics. So this kind of sort of labor/nationalist/conservative platform that he managed to cobble together for his first campaign, I thought was very effective, and that was a very different campaign from this campaign, which I found very much convincing on the economics, with weird throwbacks to kind of Reaganite libertarianism and this whole rhetoric about communism. I mean, it was like one big throwback to the 80s, which I just found much less appealing and much less convincing than his previous campaign. But I think that's also a reflection of the fact that he's learned a lesson, and he's sort of realized that there are some topics that he better stay away from. And I think that's also why he focused much more on the cultural wars than on some of the more controversial, for example, foreign policy topics. Even though, of course, he's quite outspoken about Ukraine, but he was very focused on, he was very much waging this almost like 4chan-esque, meme-based culture war, because I think he realized that that's that he could get away with that much more easily. And as you say, we can expect him to continue focusing on that, at least in the first phase of the presidency. So he might focus on cultural war issues much more than he focuses on foreign policy issues, because he probably thinks that he can get away with those much more easily. And as you say, that might be a way of slowly shifting the cultural paradigm and maybe obtaining, sort of creating a cultural context that is then more favorable to more radical policies in other areas as well. That's
Thomas,
what I to do. Yeah.
Part of this marriage between Trump and Europe, and by extension the rest of the world, is coupled with those who he has surrounded himself with. How do you think that's going to pan out? Let's say Vance, Kennedy, and weirdly enough, Musk.
Honestly, it's again, it's very hard to say because they're all very heterogeneous characters in the sense that they've got, and I think it's symptomatic of sort of the wider problem with national populist movements everywhere, more or less. So there's this agreement when it comes to cultural issues. So there's a general kind of a anti-woke approach. So when I think all the people you mentioned clearly subscribe to that worldview. So it's kind of anti-culturally progressive worldview, anti-woke worldview, and that seems to be the main glue holding them together. Because then, when you start, looking at other issues such as economic policy or even foreign policy, then we also see quite a few differences emerging. For example, between the people you mentioned, but also among, for example, right populist parties in Europe. So honestly, I don't know what to expect. I have a very hard time at the moment. Kind of imagine, just seeing how these people in a room are going to be able to come up with some kind of coherent policy when it comes to, for example, the big foreign policy issues, and also, for example, I think when it comes to foreign policy specifically, for example, Musk has taken some very kind of anti-isolationist positions when it comes to especially South America and other places, where he's kind of been very, very openly supporting opposition movements and opposition parties against elected governments in countries like Brazil and Venezuela and other countries. So we see a lot of the kind of America's bad habits re-emerging in Musk. This idea that for Latin America is our backyard and we can do whatever we want. We are going to coup whoever we want. I think Musk wrote once on X some years ago. So I think there's still a lot of contradictions when it comes to developing a coherent foreign policy. I would say, I think that clearly points to the fact that, again, as I said earlier, we are expecting a full-blown isolationist turn from Trump. I think would be very naive for the reasons we explained earlier. The influence of the deep state and the military-industrial complex, which clearly will apply huge pressures against that. But also because I think internally, within his own team, they lack a coherent vision, especially a coherent vision for a truly isolationist America. I mean, I think that's what would ultimately be in America's best interest, to just find a way to become a normal power. Because of course, America is going to remain a very powerful country, a normal power among other powers in a multipolar world. This is clearly what would also be in America's long-term interest, just as it would be in Europe's own interest. Again, I don't see Trump having developed this vision yet. His hostility to China ultimately betrays this idea that at the end of the day, the US has to try to reestablish some kind of US-led hegemonic order by essentially putting down all potential competitors, first and foremost, China. this is very problematic, not just for the world as a whole, but even just from the standpoint of America's own national interest. So I think there are a lot of question marks when it comes to what Trump is going to do, and I think that means that he's gonna, wing it a lot. Because where you lack a strategic vision, you're just gonna try to navigate your way in an incredibly complex situation. But that's not the kind of leadership you want from a country like the United States. So
well, definitely, it's very difficult to see Donald J. Trump being the elegant and strategic manager of American decline. That's obviously not what he was elected for, and that's totally incompatible with his own braggadocio and his own vanity and narcissism and so on. On the other hand, you said he would wing it. I think that's exactly right. I mean, politics, after all, here we are thinking about the great ideas and so on, but politics is largely dictated by events. Harold Macmillan once famously said, he was asked what made him change his policy, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events." So events, just things happen, and then some sort of reaction has to be scrambled together. And another big factor that perhaps political commentators overlook is sheer opportunism. We're dealing with a political class, particularly in Europe, I'm sure you'll agree with me, Thomas, which is not only incredibly elitist and anti-democratic and authoritarian and all the rest of it, but is also incredibly mediocre. And although a lot of very fanatical radicals have come to the top of the European Commission recently, we must never forget how shallow ultimately a lot of these people are. And that means that they can perhaps change tack, as I say, either as a result of events or as a result of opportunism. When I say that, I'm thinking of Olaf Scholz's remarks the other day that Ukraine should be offered neutrality, or rather Ukraine should be neutral, and that would be a basis for a peace agreement. Well, I mean, one almost falls off one's chair because we know that that's exactly what Russia has been asking for years, and that's why they went to war. And you shake your head in disbelief. How can he possibly come up with this idea when that's what the war has been being fought over? But that's what these people are like. They are so superficial that they forget what they said yesterday or even earlier in the morning. And as for to go back to events again, of course he's not going to gracefully manage the sun setting on the American empire, but it is setting on the American empire. I don't think, I mean, I'm not an expert, but I get the impression that Israel is not achieving its military goals against Hamas or against Hezbollah. It's losing, just as NATO is losing militarily. It's thrown everything in the kitchen sink into Ukraine, and it is losing for a number of reasons, including technological superiority, strategic superiority, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So, and given, of course, that the whole globalist, you mentioned Reaganism, Thomas, the whole globalist nonsense has self-destructed actually with sanctions. It's self-destructed because suddenly from what we've gone from one minute where international trade was going to bring peace and love and motherhood and apple pie to the whole world, to the world financial and commercial system becoming a weapon in the hands of the West. So it's self-destructed. So for all these reasons, I think that I'm actually, and as I say, for the reasons of symbolism I mentioned earlier, today, 6th of November, I'm pretty optimistic.
Well, I mean, I would be if I were American, because as we mentioned at the beginning, America actually enjoys a fairly good position economically at the moment. It's essentially self-sufficient when it comes to energy. Clearly it's deindustrialized when it comes to heavy industries and manufacturing, but it still plays a leading role, at least within the kind of Western bloc in high tech, in AI, and several other sectors, and of course, it still holds a huge military power. And simply in terms of GDP, it's been holding up quite well in recent years. In fact, as I mentioned, it's benefited quite quite directly in many respects from the war in Ukraine. First and foremost, by selling very expensive American liquefied gas to us at a much higher price than what we paid Russian natural gas. So I would say that if America manages to avoid nuclear war and doesn't, and its economic policies, when it comes to China, are not too idiotic, and I think America will somehow, will do okay. I'm much more worried about Europe, because Europe economically and is in a much more fragile position than the US. We have huge dependencies that the US doesn't have. First and foremost, when it comes to energy, almost fully dependent on imports for our energy supply. This is a huge problem. We have essentially sort of self-destroyed pillars of that were the kind of our own economic model, which was very much centered around kind of Germany's manufacturing sector, which was hugely dependent on low-cost Russian gas and other primary inputs, which has resulted in us falling back to falling behind. Not just the Brics and China, but the US as well. And this is, relates to this divergence that I was mentioning earlier.
We had a guest last week who talked about exactly this, a British economist who underlined how terribly the gap has widened between Europe and America. As you say, never mind China, but even with America, we have lost out.
No, Hugh, I mean, there's been a growing, and part of it was also identified in Draghi's recent competitiveness report, or lack of competitiveness report, where he mentioned how we've been falling behind in economic, technological, productivity terms. In almost every aspect, the European Union has been falling behind America, largely as a result of this disastrous proxy war against Russia, which we've allowed America to draw us in, or our leaders have allowed themselves to let themselves being drawn into. And as you mentioned, this is partly the reason. I mean, these policies are so suicidal and so contrary to America, to Europe's own strategic interests, that you really have to wonder, how is this even possible? I mean, they are so irrational. So, based on a realist understanding of international politics, this should never have happened. I mean, if we, Mersheimer, would tell us that all states, try to pursue their own national interests. That's what states do. And even in the context of the Ukraine war, virtually all the actors involved, apart from us, are doing that. There are, they're pursuing, what they legitimately can consider to be their national interest. Whether that's actually borne out by the facts or not, that's a different matter. But it can be said that they are pursuing what can be perceived from their point of view as being legitimate national interests. This cannot be said for the European Union in any respect. Clearly, this war has made no sense from an economic standpoint. It's obviously made no sense from a geopolitical and security standpoint. In the sense that obviously we face much bigger security risks today than we faced 4 years ago, by now being on the verge of a potential direct war with Russia. It's just made absolutely no sense. And I think historians are really going to be scratching their heads trying to explain this almost historically unprecedented phenomenon of not just a single country, but almost an entire continent self-condemning itself to decline through completely irrational and self-defeating policies. And
Thomas,
I think
can I ask you? Sorry to interrupt, but you're in Rome. You're half Italian, as I believe. How has this happened in Italy? Because Italy was under the first Giuseppe Conte government with Matteo Salvini and the Cinque Stelle. Was one of the most friendly to one of the countries in Europe which was most friendly to Russia. Berlusconi having, of course, prior to that, been personally very friendly with Putin. Now I know that Salvini's star has, like the Cinque Stelle, has rather waned. But how can we understand this extraordinarily ideological Meloni Atlanticism? Where has it come from, and what's happened to the realists in Rome?
Well, I think when we try to explain this Europe's suicidal policies, I think two main explaining factors come to mind. So clearly, you have America's influence and the influence of Atlanticism. And Atlanticism, I think we did not realize until recently just how profound America's influence was in Europe. And I think that's because at some point around the first in the early 2000s, and then again in the 2010s. I mean, there was a period when America had kind of slackened the reins of Europe, and so that's when we saw the opposition of major European governments against the Iraq War in the early 2000s, and then of course we have later on, and in fact back then, actually France, Germany, and Russia holding a press conference all together, criticizing the America's invasion of Iraq. I mean, amazing to think that this was happening just 20 years ago. But it says a lot about the direction that Europe was going in. And then again, we have, of course, Germany's pursuit of this neo-nationalist model throughout the from the kind of middle of the early 2000s onwards, and again against Europe, against America's desire. In fact, and that includes, of course, the building of Nord Stream 1 and then of Nord Stream 2, which were then opposed by the US. So I think a lot of what we're witnessing is a reaction to Europe asserting too much autonomy from America's perspective over the past 20 years. But America was able to do that because of the influence that, despite this kind of growing autonomy of Europe, it still it never stopped exercising, because of the deep institutional linkages that America built after World War II between its own national security state and the various national security states in Europe. Crucial part of the story. I mean, we balk at the idea that America could have committed a terrorist attack, i.e. the bombing of Nord Stream, but that forgets the whole history of Gladio and the stay-behind armies that NATO set up after World War II, and which literally engaged in terrorist acts, in false flag attacks. And Italy has a long history of that, of bombings and terrorist attacks being blamed on usually left-wing terrorists, and then later on us emerging that in fact Are you
implying that Meloni got death threats?
No. I mean, I'm just saying that this is the context. This is the context in which Europe exists, and so there's just a raw reality of the way America exercises its power in Europe that is incredibly that has to be taken into account. And then on top of that, you have the ideological influence. English is the lingua franca in Europe. It's not French, it's not German. That's the lingua franca, and that allows the Anglo establishment to wield a huge influence through all its government-funded think tanks and the media, the English language media. That's what European leaders are influenced by. And then, so this is the context. And I think this explains a lot in terms of why European leaders are so ideologically wedded to Atlanticism, because America's cultivated throughout the decades this ideology, and it's really deeply penetrated into, especially this new generation, over the past I would say especially decade and a half. This is one element, I think, and then of course you have the role of the European Union itself, which is somewhat connected also to it, because on the one hand, contrary to the idea that Europe would be this counterbalance to American power, or that the EU would be this counterbalance to American power, what we know is that in fact America strongly supported the creation of these institutions, strongly supported the ideology of European federalism, I think, because it understood that having one single overarching super government structure, which it could then influence, would have proven very beneficial rather than trying to influence every single government in Europe. And I think that's clearly what we're seeing, the European Union having essentially become an appendage of the US and NATO, and von der Leyen is very paradigmatic of that. And then when it comes, and so now because of this fusion, I would say, and I think this explains a lot of how we went from the Conte Uno government to Meloni. Now we have this fusion between the EU and NATO, and it's important to understand the loss of sovereignty that not just being a part of the EU, but especially being a part of the euro entails. Once you lose your monetary sovereignty, it basically means that you've given up every tool of all the basic tools of economic policy. The fundamental one of which is monetary policy, the ability to control your own currency. Once you give that up, you've essentially given the levers of your economic fate to someone else. In this case, the supranational institutions of the European Union, and first and foremost the ECB. And this means that you've, even from a formal standpoint, from my point of view, you've moved into a totally post-democratic scenario, even from a purely formal standpoint, because what it means is that you can elect whoever you want, whatever party you want, with whatever platform they may have, but ultimately they will lack the economic tools to implement any form of policy, especially in the economic realm, that goes against the status quo. And at any time, the European Central Bank, the EU's supranational institutions, can pull the plug on a government. And sorry, that was a bit of a long winding answer, but to answer your question, that's what the Conte Uno government. Literally, it was just as the ECB had done in 2011 when they engineered a financial crisis to get rid of Berlusconi. Also because of he was hated by the Euro-Atlantic establishment for a number of reasons, including his strong ties with Russia, Libya, and other countries, and more in general, I would say a foreign policy that was considered too autonomous in Washington. And then he was hated for other reasons, including his, cautious opposition to austerity and dislike for Merkel. They literally pulled the plug on that government by engineering soft coup, by engineering a financial crisis. And there's something very similar happened to the 2018 five-star movement Lega government, where the government almost immediately came sort of to loggerheads with the European Commission over an increase of 0.2% in the deficit. Not 2%, 0.2%. That's an increase that doesn't even, you don't even take into consideration in economics schools, because that largely has to do with exogenous factors. And you don't decide whether the deficit increases or not by 0.2%. But this led to a 6-month-long negotiation with the European Commission, which the government ultimately lost. And so the European Commission really drove a deep wedge between the two governing parties. and essentially made it very clear from the start that they would not have allowed this government, which, let's not forget, was the first true populist government to come to power in Europe, with a very strong anti-Euro platform. I mean, much more radical than the platform that virtually any government has now in Europe. And they were essentially sabotaged within a year. That's basically what happened. That led to, the two parties, collapsing upon the government coalition collapsing, and the rest is history. The Five-Star Movement completely betraying its promises, itself with the PD, and so this brings us to Meloni. Meloni has learned the lesson of the 2018 government. She knows that she can remain in power only by playing along with the Euro-Atlantic establishment. That's it.
Well, you've explained.
And
you've explained that wonderfully, Thomas. I'm glad I asked you that question, because I feel that you've, with the Italian example, you've summarised really the absolute nub of your argument. So we'll wrap up now, because we like to stick to the 1 hour format. But I know we could go on for hours, and maybe we'll get you back another time, Thomas. We'd love to have you on if we could talk about something a little bit more focused, maybe, I don't know, Georgia or the European Commission or something. I know that you write on a lot of subjects, but that last answer given is I'm sure has impressed all our listeners, because it does indeed explain the link between globalization, the European Union, Atlanticism, and the end of democracy. And that's the world that we live in. Thomas, Fazi, thank you so much, and thank you to all our listeners for watching. All the best, everyone. See you at the same time next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.